This slideshow was created by Amira Sims, and it's also narrated by Amira Sims. And I made it so that it could enhance your understanding of some key concepts in Chapter 1, not replace reading Chapter 1. The beginnings, the science of human development. In Chapter 1, we're going to explore the following 4 topics: understanding how and why, the lifespan perspective, theories of human development, and the scientific method. These are some questions to keep in mind. Why is the study of people a science? Are people the same always and everywhere, or is each person unique, changing from day to day? Do all the major theories of human development agree with each other? And what cautions do developmental scientists need to remember? Understanding how and why. So this slide, we're going to look at information presented in Chapter 1 of our course textbook, Invitation to the Lifespan by Kathleen, Stassen, Berger, and it's primarily pages 4 through 7. And we'll start with the definition. The science of human development is the science that seeks to understand how and why people of all ages and circumstances change or remain the same over time. And we talk about development over the lifespan, we want to consider 4 characteristics. It's multidirectional, multi-contextual, multicultural, and plastic. And you'll hear these terms come up again, but for now, let's go over these terms very briefly. What we mean by multidirectional is that there's both growth and decline. You can think about gaining weight and losing hair as examples. It's multi-contextual. So we're studying people and we realize that different contexts, so different situations, circumstances can affect development. It can affect how you grow, how you maintain, and how you decline. It's multicultural. So culture is everywhere. Culture determines what food you eat, what music you listen to, what religion you practice, and at the same time, culture is shaped by generations. All right, and then plastic. Plasticity is saying that there's some flexibility. You know, we're not static. We're dynamic beings. All right, the other part of looking at lifespan development, and in particular the science of human development, is to remember that science is what we are is our starting point. Quite frankly, our ending point also. As you can see on the slide, it says process, not proof. So we're talking about the scientific method. You want to begin with curiosity. So ask a question. You know, you have an idea. Then you want to develop a hypothesis, which is testable. So an educated guess that you can actually test. Then you want to actually test the hypothesis by gathering empirical evidence, so data. Then you draw conclusions and you report the results. And you don't stop there. Replication is important because we want to find out if these results can be substantiated. So curiosity is king and process, not proof. The last thing I want to mention is the idea of nature-nurture. So before, there was a big debate whether nature or nurture had played a more important role in determining who you become. But in fact, we know now that it's not nature or nurture, but rather nature and nurture work together. They interact. All right. So nature is going to be your genes, your genetic blueprint. And nurture refers to the environment. And this includes everything from your mother's nutrition while she was pregnant with you to the culture or nation that influences you. And so nature and nurture interact. They work hand in hand. When you see the word epigenetics, this is letting you know that epigenetics is the study of how environmental factors affect genes and genetic expression, enhancing, halting, shaping, or altering the expression of genes. This is a very good example of how nature and nurture are interacting, showing that it's not one or the other. The lifespan perspective. So we're going to look at these characteristics of the lifespan a little bit more closely. And you can find this information on pages 8 through 21 in our course textbook, Invitation to the Lifespan by Kathleen, Stassen, Berger, 4th edition. And even though we're going from pages 8 to 21, we'll spend an additional slide talking about development is multi-contextual. All right, so let's get started with development is multi-directional. This is saying that there's growth and decline across the lifespan, which makes sense. What we want to point out is that when we say there are changes that include gains and losses, those changes are varied. Okay, so the pace of change is not specific to any one person. You could have rapid change. You could have slow change. You could have lots of ups and downs in one period, or just a few ups and downs. And these changes can be radical or they can be minimal. But we're talking about gains and losses over the course of the lifespan. Two key words I want to point out is sensitive periods and critical periods. You can find this on page 9 in your textbook. I'll read the definition and provide a few more pointers. So we'll start with a critical period. A critical period is a time when a particular development must occur. If it does not, as when something toxic prevents that growth, then it cannot develop later. You can read about the thalidomide incident on page 9, and this was something that happened from 1957 to 1961 when doctors in 30 nations were prescribing pregnant women with a drug called thalidomide, and the thalidomide was an anti-nausea drug. And so obviously when you're pregnant, one of the symptoms is that you feel nauseous. And so doctors were prescribing this medication, and as women ingested this substance, we found out later that depending on when the woman took the thalidomide, their baby was born with the birth defect. So some had no arms or legs, or some legs or arms were malformed, and they were able to connect it to at what point the woman consumed or ingested this substance. So this is just showing that there are critical periods in development. So there's a time when this is developing, and that's the only time for that to develop. And if you're exposed to teratogen, something that could harm the baby, then obviously development is forever altered. Another term, sensitive period, similar but not quite the same. A sensitive period is a time when a particular developmental growth is most likely to occur, although it may still happen later. And a good example of this would be when you're learning a language. The optimal time for learning a language is prior to puberty. Okay, you have a lot of changes in your brain, the way it's rewiring. And so learning a language prior to puberty is a great time. That's a sensitive period. However, you can learn a language late in life. You can learn a language after puberty and you'll be fine. It's just saying that the optimal time would be, in the beginning. All right, so that's development is multidirectional. For development is multi-contextual, think about some different contexts. So contexts include, you could think about the historical context. So if you grew up in the 1950s compared to the 1990s, obviously you're going to have a slightly different outlook on life. And there are some things that may influence you just from being born in that era. So that's an example of context. Another example would be growing up in a single parent household compared to growing up in a household where the mother and father are married or cohabitating. And each of these three different contexts will again shape development. We'll come back to talking about development being multi-contextual on the next slide when we talk about Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory. All right, development is multicultural, and culture is everywhere. I like to think of culture as an analogy. If we were flowers, if we're plants, right? Culture is going to be the air that we breathe. It's going to be the sunlight that we are exposed to, the water that we're fed. So culture is a pretty big deal. And there's a term that I want to point out. It's on page 14 in your course textbook, and it's called social constructions. I'm going to read this term and then I'll try to break it down for you, although it's pretty straightforward. Social constructions, an idea that is built on shared perceptions, not an objective reality. I'll read that one more time. An idea that is built on shared perceptions, not on objective reality. So with the social construction is how it affects how people think, what they do, what they value, and it might feel like it's the absolute truth, but in reality, it's not objective. It's very subjective. And this is saying that, in one culture, we may think of doing something one way, and it seems like that's the only way or the best way, but in reality, there's other ways to do it. The last one here is development is plastic. And there's two points that I want to mention, and you can find these in your course textbook under the heading of plasticity. And it's just saying that people can change over time. All right. And by just to give you a reference, that is going to be page 19. So people can change over time, and new behavior depends partly on what has already happened. As we said before, development is multi-contextual. So I'm going to read a short passage from page 11 in our course textbook, and figure 1.4 shows a diagram of the ecological model, and you can see that also here on the slide. According to developmental researcher Urie Bronfenbrenner, each person is significantly affected by interactions among a number of overlapping systems, which provide the context of development. Microsystems, family, peer group, classroom, neighborhood, house of worship, intimately and immediately shape human development. Surrounding and supporting the microsystems are the exosystems, which include all of the external networks such as community structures and local educational, medical, employment, and communication systems that affect the microsystems. Influencing both of these systems is the macrosystem, which includes cultural patterns, political philosophies, economic policies, and social conditions. Mesosystems refer to interactions among systems, as when parents and teachers coordinate to educate a child. Bronfenbrenner eventually added a fifth system, the chronosystem, to emphasize the importance of historical time. I encourage you to click on this YouTube video here, and you get another professor's perspective on Urie Bronfenbrenner's systems approach, or the ecological model, and she goes over this model in about 5 to 7 minutes, so providing a little bit more detail for you. So development is multicultural, and to highlight some common misconceptions, I've decided to share 2 additional videos. One is an informal talk by a YouTuber, and she gives a PSA on race, nationality, ethnicity, and she says these terms are not interchangeable. Her talk is brief, is very informal. She does use a couple of curse words, but overall she has provided some pretty good information, and it's down to earth and straightforward, and I thought it was worth sharing in this class. You can read more about race and ethnicity in our course textbook, starting on page 14 with the title Development is Multicultural. You start getting a little bit of information about how, what culture is. We talked about social constructions, but then when you move on to page 16 and 17, they give you a little bit more about diversity and race and ethnicity. A couple of the points I want to make is that there's a second video I included, which is a more formal talk. It's a semi-formal talk by an anthropologist, Nina Jablonski, and she breaks the illusion of skin color. And I thought it was worthwhile to share this video because, a lot of times people equate race with skin color, but quite frankly, depending on where you are on the globe, you could be classified as one race or another, because race is a social construct. Okay, so it's something that was man-made. There are no real distinct races. We're all one human race. However, people can share some commonalities, hence, the construct of race. Ethnicity focuses more on culture. So often in the literature, you'll find information about culture studying ethnicity rather than studying race. Theories of human development. So this section begins on page 22 in the course textbook, and I'm going to read the definition for developmental theory. A group of ideas, assumptions, and generalizations about human growth. A developmental theory provides a framework to interpret growth and change. So basically, a theory explains and predicts behavior and mental processes. And in the case of developmental theories, we're trying to understand how people change over their lifespan. And these different theories are different explanations. So on the slide, you'll see images of people, famous people, who have theories that, have made it to our course textbook and quite frankly, to most textbooks on human growth and development. And a lot of this may be familiar from a general psychology class. So I'm going to give you just the basics of the ones that are on the slide, and we'll start with the psychoanalytic approach. This is the big idea is that people are heavily influenced by what happens to them early in life, and also that their unconscious is extremely important in influencing what they do and don't do. So Sigmund Freud is an example of someone who's associated with this psychoanalytic approach. There's also Erik Erikson, who tries to understand changes across the entire lifespan, but he's still considered a psychoanalytic theorist because he was trained by Anna Freud and he believes the importance of the unconscious is important, and some other characteristics that he shares with the psychoanalytic approach. Next is behaviorism, and on the screen you'll see an image of B.F. Skinner holding a pigeon, and also Marion Breland Bailey, who worked with Skinner. And both the big idea with behaviorism is that we should focus on behavior. If we want to understand people and how they change, we should look at what they do on a day-to-day basis, what they've done over the course of their lifespans. Then we move into the cognitive approach, and you've already been exposed to Jean Piaget and his idea that the mind is so vast and so worthy of exploration. So you'll hear Piaget again and again throughout the course. We'll be exposed to Piaget. For social learning theory, we have a picture of Bandura, and Bandura says that people learn from watching other people. They learn from being in different situations. And so, yes, we should understand their behavior, but we can't forget about the social context. So later when we explore the Bobo doll experiment, Bandura is your guy. Last but not least is the evolutionary approach. And this, we have an image of Darwin representing the evolutionary approach to human development. But keep in mind, Darwin was a scientist, not a psychologist, but a lot of his ideas about the way we're influenced, multi-generational, and we're influenced based on reproduction, though they have seeped into, ways to explain why people do what they do. The scientific method. So we've already previewed the scientific method earlier in our slideshow, but here on page 29, we take a closer look at the scientific method. We're going to distinguish between two types of research, and neither is better than the other. What questions you ask really drive what type of research you're going to conduct. So with qualitative research, the goal is to gain an understanding of the reasons and motivations for people doing what they do, right? You want to uncover trends in opinion. You might ask questions that start with why or how or what. Quantitative research, on the other hand, is when you want to quantify data and generalize results. You ask questions that are like how many, how much, how often. With qualitative research, you tend to have a small number of non-representative cases. Think back to the famous case of Phineas Gage, right? He was a man who was a railroad worker who had a very bizarre incident where a tamping iron went through his skull and took out a chunk of brain. Well, certainly we want to understand more about this person in this situation, right? So we might do a case study and get a lot of information about this one person. So the sample is small and we're asking what, how, and why. And other examples of data collection methods, techniques for qualitative research includes interviews and focus groups. You tend to deal with non-statistical data analysis. All right, you use words. Now with quantitative research, we said already that you want to quantify the data. You tend to have a large number of cases representing the population of interest. So you get a sample, and your sample needs to be representative of the larger group that you are generalizing to. An example would be conducting a survey, right? We may want to find out students' opinions about, the transition from face-to-face to online, and we may conduct a survey with a large group of students, and then we can use that information to understand how students are feeling and how often they're logging on. Simulations are another example of a data collection technique associated with quantitative research. And then you have, statistical analysis. Now, in your textbook on page 29, there's table 1.7, statistical measures often used to analyze search results. And you can find out several measures of effect size, significance, cost-benefit analysis, odds ratio, factor analysis, and meta-analysis. And in your textbook, they give you more detailed explanations for each of these measures. I encourage you to take a look at that. The scientific method continued. All right, so on page 30, you'll learn a little bit about scientific observation. And I'll read the definition here. Watching and recording participants' behavior in a systematic and objective manner, in a natural setting, in a laboratory, or in searches of archival data. So there's a lot of different ways to observe people. As I mentioned, it could be in a natural setting. So the person that you're observing or people that you're watching, they are in their normal habitat, or it could be in the lab, or it could be examining archival data. Now, the key with scientific observation is systematic and objective. Okay, so it's systematic, and it's you're doing it in a way that you're trying to minimize the subjective nature of watching people. So you're trying to get rid of observer bias. Experiments. So with an experiment, this method is where the researcher adds one variable called the independent variable and then observes the effect on another variable called the dependent variable in order to learn if the independent variable causes change in the dependent variable. So think of the independent variable as the cause and the dependent variable as the effect. So the independent variable, or IV, is the thing that the researcher controls or manipulates, and the dependent variable is the thing the researcher measures, right? They give you some examples beginning on page 30 and continuing on to page 31, and I encourage you to take a look at that. Also, when we're watching the different videos throughout this course, researchers will tend to describe their experiments that they've conducted, and so you can try to identify the independent and dependent variables when you're watching these videos. Finally, surveys. And we mentioned surveys previously when we were talking about quantitative data, but there's a little bit more info about surveys on pages 32 and 33 of your textbook. Really just page 32. All right, so a survey is a research method in which information is collected from a large number of people by interviews, written questionnaires, or some other means. All right, so those are three ways to, use the scientific method to ask and answer questions about human development. There's also some other ways, and these other ways consider time. So studying development over the lifespan and thinking about time, you talk about cross-sectional versus longitudinal research. With longitudinal research, this happens over a very long period of time. So you take one group of people and you watch them at 5-year, 10-year, 15-year, 20-year, and you're finding out about the change, looking at the change in the person over this long period of time. All right. With the cross-sectional approach, you take different groups of people okay, different ages, and you look at them at one time. So maybe 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds, all at one time. And you get a different or fresh sample, each time. The results from the cross-sectional study delivers a snapshot of a given point of time, whereas the results of a longitudinal study provides details of change over time. There's also something called cross-sequential analysis, and I'll read the definition, but you can imagine what it is. It's a hybrid research design that includes cross-sectional and longitudinal research, also called cohort sequential research or time sequential research. You're basically getting the best of longitudinal and cross-sectional research and also the worst of the two. So you take a diverse group of people, meaning 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and 15-year-olds. You test those people in increments, over a long period of time. So you do a little bit of both.